title of my message tonight is From the Goo to You. Paul the Apostle in Romans chapter 1, verse 20 said, "For since the creation of the world, His," that is God's, "invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." In this verse, Paul expresses this fundamental biblical truth that the existence of God should be obvious to all men. According to Paul, the evidence for God's existence is found in the things that are made. All we need to do is look around and examine creation, and it should speak to our hearts that indeed there is a creator, according to Paul. And he says that those who do not believe are without excuse, because the evidence from creation demands a creator. Until the middle of the 19th century, the prevailing worldview, even among the world's university intelligentsia, was that the universe and its life forms were the result of intelligent design from a transcendent supernatural creator. However, in the last 150 years, there's been an incredible paradigm shift. We now have a predominant worldview in the media and in our educational systems, which says that we're all the products of chance, that we evolved from the primordial goo. The biblical notion of a transcendent creator is now ridiculed as scientifically irrational, unscientific, according to the scientific intelligentsia of the world. Incredibly, the Bible and its view of creation have been thrown out of the public schools in the United States, and what was once the most revered book in the land, the first textbook in the first public school in America, is now treated as contraband, mere contraband, by the scientific and educational establishments. The seed for this remarkable shift occurred in 1859 with the publishing of Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species. In his book, Charles Darwin sought to explain the origin of all life forms without the benefit of intelligent guidance or supernatural intellect or any kind of act of creation. The millions of animal species that we see, according to Darwin, is the result of descent with modification, blind descent, random chance with modification over time. The birthplace of this theory was the Galapagos Islands off of the coast of South America. Darwin traveled there as a young man, and he noticed a lot of incredible variation in the various species on the island, especially in the finch population. Darwin noticed that there were a lot of different sizes of finches, a lot of different colored finches, that they had a wide variety of beak shapes. Some finches had very thick, heavy beaks, some very thin, long beaks, and some finches even used their beaks as tools, would hold sticks and use the sticks as tools to get worms out of holes and things like that. And so Darwin went home from the Galapagos Islands and began to formulate basically the Darwinian theory of evolution. Darwin felt that the finches had arrived there, a small number of finches, at least two for sure, had arrived there by either traveling on a log from the mainland or they'd been blown offshore by a storm. And that over time, that finch, those two or few original finches, had evolved into all the different finch species, and that the finch species that he saw were indeed separate, distinct populations. He believed at his time that those finch species were not interbreedable. He felt they were distinct species. Now, the definition of a species, if you ask 5 biologists, you're going to get 8 opinions exactly what a species is. But in general, a species is defined as a pool of interbreeding animals. A group of animals that interbreed in the wild successfully is defined as a species. And Darwin believed that the individual finch species were indeed distinct, separate species, and they had evolved over time from a common pair or small number of finches many years earlier. Well, Darwin went home and he began to formulate his theory of evolution. Darwin felt that the various traits that he saw in the finch population, the color, the size of the animal, the size of the beaks, the various variations in the traits of the organisms, was due to what he called mutability. Darwin said, this is his first principle, the first principle of Darwin's theory, was that the inherited traits of all animals are mutable. And by mutable, he meant that over time, the information necessary, say, to produce the beak could be altered or changed and result in a large number of variations of what was an original code or that produced the original beak size. This mutability, Darwin proposed, was the source of all the variation that we see in living systems. We'll get back to that a little bit when we talk about DNA and things. Darwin proposed that periodically a mutation of one of those traits would be beneficial to an organism. He proposed that these beneficial mutations would increase the fitness of an organism and allow that organism to survive to reproductive maturity and pass that beneficial mutation on to the next generation. Less beneficial mutations, he proposed, would cause the organism to not be able to compete successfully and cause the organism to lose out in the struggle of the survival of the fittest, in a sense, according to Darwin. Now, Darwin said that those organisms with a favorable collection of traits are selected by nature, by default. Those organisms that have the best grouping of favorable traits in their particular environment are selected by nature. And by that he means they are allowed to go on to reproductive maturity. And eventually, over time, he proposed that this selection, which he called natural selection, eventually would produce the mutation of the traits plus natural selection, would eventually produce entirely new species, which could not breed with the parent species that they came from. And that's basically the fundamentals of Darwin's theory of evolution. Now, natural selection is not an active process. It's not like nature chooses one organism over another. It's simply that those organisms that are, quote, most fit, according to Darwin, are the ones that survived and passed their genetic information on to the next generation. He said that an organism is more fit if it successfully competes for resources and lives to the age of reproductive maturity. That is, in effect, Darwinism in a nutshell. That's Darwinian fitness, as he called it. During Darwin's time, the method of information storage in living systems was not known. They had no idea how the information to produce hearts and lungs and eyeballs, etc., was stored in living systems. However, in 1953, Francis Crick and James Watson discovered the DNA molecule, which we've talked about before. They described the structure of the DNA molecule, and they showed that the DNA molecule stores the information necessary to produce all the structures in all the organisms on planet Earth. The DNA molecule is essentially long strands of nucleotides, which are the chemical letters of the genetic code. Two strands of nucleotides are bonded together in what looks like a ladder that has been twisted on itself. It's called the double spiral helix. And the information on the DNA molecule is stored digitally. That is, it's measurable in mathematical terms. As Chuck mentioned, the information is error correcting. When a DNA molecule makes a copy of itself, it goes along, there's a protein that goes along and feels the DNA molecule to feel for incorrectly placed nucleotides. If it finds one, it puts the correct nucleotide in. So it's an error-correcting code. The information is also overlapping. There are segments of DNA that can code for more than one functional protein. So it's an extremely complex information storage and retrieval system. Well, with this understanding of the information storage system, Darwinism was reformulated into what is called the Neo-Darwinian formulation, and it goes like this. Darwin spoke about mutations, that the traits in living systems were mutable. Scientists began to propose that the source of mutations was simply the incorrect placement of nucleotides on the DNA molecule. So that when a DNA molecule was copied, it would produce, occasionally mutations would occur, which is the incorrect placement of a nucleotide, the chemical letter of the DNA molecule, and that mutation was, according to the Neo-Darwinian synthesis, the source of all the variations that we see in all the organisms on planet Earth. Again, this Neo-Darwinian synthesis proposes that occasionally mutations will be beneficial. And these beneficial mutations will increase the survivability of an organism, allow it to live to reproductive maturity, and allow it to basically pass that genetic information to the next generation. And over time, mutations plus Darwin's natural selection produces new species. And that's what they call the neo-Darwinian formulation. Over time, they believe that beneficial mutations are concentrated in the population and that harmful mutations or lethal mutations are eliminated from the population. Over time, neo-Darwinists propose that natural selection, coupled with millions of beneficial mutations, will produce a population of individuals which is better adapted and more fit for the environment that they occupy. Now, when I was in college, this is what was taught to me, and it seemed totally reasonable. I bought it totally. And for many years, I believed that this was a reasonable mechanism for the explanation of complex systems like eyes and hearts and lungs and livers and kidneys. We know, for example, that mutations can produce a certain degree of variability. You can mutate plants and produce various changes in the color of flowers. But to produce an entirely new organism, or to produce a system such as the visual system by random mutation, it turns out now, with the understanding of information theory and understanding of molecular biology, is now shown to be impossible. And we'll look at that. According to Darwin's theory, all the life forms on planet Earth began as a single-celled organism, something like an amoeba. Over time, that single-celled amoeba evolved into all the different life forms that we see on planet Earth. Now, if you look at this from an information point of view, to change an amoeba to a man would require the production of tremendous amounts of new information. Darwinian theory says that we went from an amoeba, evolved through all the animals, up to man, from the goo through the zoo to you, over 3 billion years. That's Darwinian theory. Now, if that's true, it turns out that to do that, you would have to generate billions of bits of beneficial information. An amoeba has approximately 2 million nucleotide pairs in its genetic code. A human being has, some people believe, about 6 billion nucleotide pairs. So the human being is about 3,000 times more complex in terms of its information content than an amoeba, according to information theory. Now, according to the principles of information theory, the information required to create or synthesize an organism or a machine is directly proportional to its complexity. For example, the space shuttle is way more complex than a paper airplane. And indeed, when you look at the instruction manual necessary to produce a space shuttle, it's vastly greater than the instruction manual necessary to produce a paper airplane. Man is vastly more complex than amoeba. Therefore, the instructions necessary are much greater. Now, according to neo-Darwinian theory, the information required to change the code to produce an amoeba, a single-celled organism, was mutated over time and turned into the code to produce a man. Something like an amoeba. We don't know exactly for sure. Evolution took the existing program of an amoeba and converted it over time into the code and the program necessary to produce man. Now, let me read you a couple of quotes about mutations. Some people will say that there's other sources of information other than mutation to change a code. But it turns out that the only known source of potential new information is mutations, those incorrect substitutions of nucleotides during the reproduction of DNA. Theodosius Dobzhansky, in his article on the methods of evolutionary biology and anthropology in the American Scientists in December 1957, said this: "The process of mutation is the only known source of the raw materials of genetic variability, and hence of evolution. The mutants which arise are, with rare exceptions, deleterious to their carriers, at least in the environments which the species normally encounters." Another gentleman, Ernst Mayr, in Evolutionary Challenges to the Mathematical Interpretation of Evolution, writing in 1967 in the Wistar Institute of Anatomy, he said that ultimately all variation is, of course, due to mutation. It turns out that when you look at mutations, which is the supposed mechanism for producing new information to produce all the life forms on Earth, out of 10,000 mutations, 9,999 of them are either harmful or lethal or, at best, neutral. 1 out of 10,000 mutations might be beneficial, according to scientists. There are diseases that are lethal diseases that are the result of a single mutation. Now, if 9,999 mutations out of 10,000 are harmful or lethal or at best neutral to a population, it means that over time, you're going to have, for every one mutation that accumulates in a population, you're going to have thousands and thousands of mutations that are harmful or lethal to the population. And this proposes a serious dilemma for the neo-Darwinian synthesis. Lethal mutations, of course, cause the organism to die, usually before it reaches the age of reproductive maturity. But harmful mutations are passed to the next generation. And the result is, for every beneficial mutation, you're going to get thousands of harmful mutations. And the result is, according to many theorists, that the population will go extinct long before you get the production of any new structures or functions in an organism. Now, Chuck's talked about information theory and information a lot to you tonight and on previous occasions. When a programmer sits down to write a computer code, and he spends an enormous amount of time and energy to write a code, if errors occur in the writing of a code, that's called a bug. And bugs are bad things in computer programs. And I had a bug in my computer, and that caused it to go down, not to function. Now, a mutation is the informational equivalent of a bug in the program. Now, one gentleman named C.P. Martin, he's a biologist. He wrote an article called A Non-Geneticist Looks at Evolution in the American Scientist, January 1953, page 102, said, mutations are more than just sudden changes in heredity. They also affect the viability of a population. And to the best of our knowledge, they invariably affect it adversely. Mutations are harmful to DNA. Just like bugs are harmful to codes and programs, mutations are harmful to DNA. Now, another problem for the idea that codes and programs can be improved by mutation is the second law of thermodynamics. We've talked about that a little bit in this series. The second law of thermodynamics is the law of physics that says with the advance of time in closed systems, the amount of order in a system always decreases. When you look at that from an information point of view, it means that the amount of information in a system always decreases as time advances. For example, when they wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls 2,000 years ago, over time, aging process caused the ink to fall off, caused the Dead Sea Scrolls to lose information. In the 1960s, when the Beatles recorded their initial albums on analog tape, 30 years later, they went back and listened to those tapes, and they found noise. With the advance of time, the second law causes information to break down, not to increase. And so it presents a tremendous problem if you're going to say that over time you can improve a code, especially when the vast majority of these mutations are either lethal or harmful to a population. Now let's look at the question of the origin of complex structures like hearts and lungs and eyes and other structures. The primary postulate of Darwinian evolution is that interbreeding populations change over long time periods into new species which are genetically distinct from their predecessors. For example, evolutionists believe that amphibians evolved into reptiles. They also believe that reptiles evolved over time into birds and into mammals. If this is true, it means that these organisms pass through innumerable intermediate stages on the path to forming a new species. For example, if a reptile evolved into birds, then a number of new body types and parts had to be developed. They had to develop lightweight bones for flight. Wings had to evolve from the forelimbs of the reptile, and feathers presumably had to evolve and replace scales. These kinds of changes are not trivial. They involve major changes in the structure and the function of the organism, and they require the addition of millions and millions of bits of new information to the genetic code of the ancestral organism. Darwin recognized that if evolution was true, there should be millions and millions and millions of these transitional or intermediate forms. And indeed, Darwin said in his book, The Origin of Species, if my theory is true, those transitional forms should be found in the fossil record. And as I'll show you, to date, they haven't found them. Chuck mentioned a quote by Michael Denton. Michael Denton said that a single cell is more complex than any machine made by man. That means that a single amoeba that you find in pond scum is more complicated than a space shuttle or a Cray supercomputer. Imagine that. A single amoeba. So the next time you're walking along and you decide to squish that bug on the sidewalk, just remember, you just squished an incredibly complex structure, more complex than a space shuttle. Now, when we examine the structure of a complex machine like the space shuttle, we see a variety of what we call interdependent systems. There are systems for information storage and retrieval, such as the onboard computers on the space shuttle. There are systems for maintaining the proper environment inside the cabin. There are systems which function to generate and facilitate the use of energy throughout the space shuttle's electronic systems. There are navigational systems, communication systems, and systems involved in the guidance and the landing of the space shuttle. When we look at living systems, it's very similar. In mammals, for example, we find a visual system for the processing of light, an olfactory system which provides a sense of smell, an auditory system for hearing, a respiratory system to maintain proper oxygen balance, a cardiovascular system to deliver oxygen to the entire body, and we find waste removal systems such as the liver and the kidney to purify the bloodstream. And we find a reproductive system which requires the participation of two different types of individuals with specialized reproductive machinery in order to create a copy of themselves. It's incredible. Now, all of these systems interact with each other. But when you look at one of the systems, say look at the visual system, each of these systems are highly complex systems composed of multiple components. Each of the systems, in order to function appropriately, requires that all of the subsystems or components be present. For example, in the visual system, there are at least 6 major components to the visual system. If you have only 4 or 5 of the components, the organism cannot see. Let me read you a quote by John Stevens about the visual system. John Stevens, writing in Reverse Engineering the Brain in Byte magazine, April 1985, page 287. He said, while today's digital hardware is extremely impressive, it is clear that the human retina's real-time performance goes unchallenged. Actually, to simulate 10 milliseconds of the complete processing of even a single nerve cell from the retina would require the solution of about 500 simultaneous nonlinear differential equations 100 times each, and would take at least several minutes of processing time on a Cray supercomputer. Keep in mind that there are 10 million or more such retinal cells interacting with each other in complex ways, and that's each eyeball, 10 million retinal cells. He said it would take a minimum of 100 years of Cray supercomputer time to simulate what takes place in your eye many times every second. So for every second that your 2 eyes are processing visual information, it would take 200 years of Cray supercomputer time to equal the amount of calculations that your retina does in 1 second. The Bible says that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Now, that was in 1985. Cray supercomputers are a lot faster now. It probably now would only take 50 years of Cray supercomputer time to simulate 1 second. The visual system is composed of numerous highly complex subsystems, each of which must be present or the system does not function. In the eyeball, we see a lens which focuses the light on the back of the retina. If I look at my finger, the light reflected off my finger goes through the lens and hits the back of my eyeball upside down. In the retina, we see a highly complex chemical system which converts the photons bouncing off of my finger into electrons. These electrons are then sent down, for lack of a better term, a wire, which is the optic nerve, which then sends the visual signal to 3 different areas in the brain. The first area, called the geniculate body in the brain, is where the visual information is first gathered. It is then sent to the occipital cortex, which is in the back of the brain. In the occipital cortex, my finger is then displayed right side up again in the occipital cortex. It is then sent to the frontal lobes of the brain where pattern recognition occurs, and I say, oh, it's a finger. Or, oh, it's a train. I better move. It's going to run me over. Or, oh, it's a predator that's going to eat me, so I better run. So clearly the system provides some benefit for organisms that have it. Now the problem is that unless every one of those subsystems is present, the visual system does not function. The same is true for the auditory system, the respiratory system, All the different major systems in your body require that all the parts be there or they do not function. One of the most difficult aspects of Neo-Darwinian theory is to propose how highly complex systems, which are composed of multiple subsystems, could have arisen over a long period of time, being produced in a piecemeal or a step-by-step fashion. And we're going to look at that in a little bit. According to Neo-Darwinian theory, the visual system and all the other complex systems in our body were produced over millions of years by the gradual accumulation of mutations necessary to produce each of the subcomponents. Okay? Now I want you to remember that. These subcomponents then gradually were brought together. The eyeball was created, and the retina was created, and the wire was created, and the geniculate body was created, then the occipital cortex, then the connections from the occipital cortex to the frontal lobe were gradually created, and voila, the organism can see. Supposedly this occurred over a period of millions and millions and millions of years. Let's look at this scenario. Let's go back to Pastor Chuck's favorite illustration on evolution, the primordial worm. Pastor Chuck likes to talk about this worm. Evolutionists say that about 800 million years ago or so, give or take a couple of 100 million years, that there was a worm that had a mutation in its reproductive system, and it caused all of its baby worms to be born with two pigmented spots on its forehead. These pigmented spots represented a primordial or early retina. Question: could these worms see? No, of course not. The presence of a retina does not allow these worms to see. So the mutations that occurred to produce the early retina, since they do not increase the survival, the likelihood of survival of this worm, they will not be concentrated in the population, but they are lost due to the process of genetic drift over time. You see, in order for a mutation to be concentrated in the population, it has to provide some benefit for the organism. Now, if you get this one point, actually there's 2 points I want you to get, but this is the first one. If you can see this one point that I'm doing right now, this will allow you to derail anybody, even professors of evolution at UCI and UCR. Now, what if the baby worms were born with complete eyeballs? You have a blind worm, it has some mutations, and a bunch of baby worms are born, and they've got beautifully formed eyeballs on their forehead. Can the worms see? No, they cannot see, because the eyeballs are not connected to the brain. And so the mutations that gave rise to those beautifully formed eyeballs will not be concentrated in the population. They do not provide any benefit. They will be lost. And so the experiment to produce eyeballs will be a failure. What if the baby worms were born with the eyeball, the nerve, the optic nerve, the geniculate body, and the occipital cortex, but the connections to the rest of the parts of the brain were not there? Could the worm see? The answer is no. In fact, even if the worm was born with, in one generation, which according to scientists would be what they call a hopeful monster, it's not going to happen in one generation. Hopeful monster, they call it. If that were to occur, even if it had 95% of the visual system in one generation, it could not see. And this point is critical if you're going to get past the struggle of Darwinism. Darwinism only allows, Darwinian evolution only allows for the production of structures if it increases the survivability of the organism. And the problem with complex systems like the visual system is unless all the parts are there together, the mutations that gave rise to a few parts here and there will not increase the survivability of the organism, and those mutations will be lost. They will not be concentrated in the population. And that's point one that I want you to get. Let me read you a couple of quotes on that. Arthur Koestler, in his book, The Ghost in the Machine, writing in 1968, said this: each mutation occurring alone would be wiped out before it could be combined with the others. They are all interdependent. The doctrine that their coming together was due to a series of blind coincidences is an affront not only to common sense, but to the basic principles of scientific explanation. Charles Darwin, writing in his book Origin of Species, on page 75, said this about the eye. He said, to suppose that the eye, with all of its intimate contrivances, for adjusting focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. Charles Darwin wrote a lot about the eye, and he said the eye just gave him fits. He couldn't see how a complex system could arise by chance over a long period of time in a piecemeal fashion. Finally, Robert Jastrow, a NASA astronomer who likes to dabble in a lot of different areas in science, said in Science Digest, December 1981, in an article called Evolution, Selection for Perfection, he said it's hard to accept the evolution of the human eye as a product of chance. It is even harder to accept the evolution of human intelligence as the product of random disruptions in the brain cells of our ancestors. The problem is that unless all the parts are there, the mutations that give rise to the subparts don't increase the survivability of the organism. In my office one day, I was going about my business, and I had a gentleman that came in to me to do a physical. He needed a physical. And I walked in the room, and I noticed that he had a book in his lap, Darwin's Origin of Species. And I thought, all right, Lord. All right. Another divine appointment. I did his physical. I was very nice, very friendly. I wanted to really get buddy-buddy with this gentleman. Turns out he was the senior professor of evolutionary biology at the University of California in Riverside. And trying not to sound like a Bible-thumping fundamentalist Christian, I said, I'm a skeptic when it comes to Darwinism. I said, could you explain to me how random mutations could, over a long period of time, produce a system such as the visual system when the mutations that gave rise to the primordial eye do not increase the survivability of the organism? And he's like, the hard drive failure that I had in my computer yesterday? It was a similar look. And he said, well, we have examples of lower life forms that do have primitive visual systems. I said, yeah. I said, for example. And he said, well, okay, for example, the horseshoe crab. He said the horseshoe crab has a very primitive eye that allows the horseshoe crab to sense between light and dark. And I said, you're absolutely right. And I said, but you know what? The horseshoe crab has all the basic parts of the visual system in place. It has a primitive lens to focus the light on a primitive retina. The retina has all the chemicals necessary to convert photons to electrons. It has a wire which takes from that eye and sends it to the brain. And from the brain, that light information is integrated and tells the organism it's dark outside or it's light outside. And I said, yes, it's a primitive eye compared to ours, but in function, it's primitive in function, but in theory, it's identical because it has all the 5 subcomponents of the visual system present. And it is not a transitional eye. It is a complete eye, albeit not as finely tuned as mine. And I said, show me an example of a transitional organ or organ system. And he couldn't do it. Could not do it. And I said, Darwinian evolution does not have the capability of explaining the origin of systems which are made of multiple subsystems, each of which is required to function. He hasn't been back to see me since then. I think he figured out that I was a Bible-thumping fundamentalist or something. I don't know. Now, the next question we'll look at is the question of natural selection. And the question is, can natural selection produce new information or complex structures? It's well documented that natural selection can indeed preserve favorable traits within a population. But it turns out that natural selection, that is, nature allowing organisms with beneficial traits to survive, does not produce any new information. It only allows the beneficial information that already exists in a population to survive. It is not a creative process. Now, let's look at the question of natural selection. Can natural selection, working on mutations, produce new and complex structures? You remember that I mentioned to you that evolutionists believe that reptiles evolved into birds. According to Darwinism, the forelimb of some ancient reptile gradually evolved into the wing of a bird. The process took millions and millions of years. And the scenario goes something like this. 500 million years ago, 300 million years ago, there was a reptile running around that had some mutations that caused it to have offspring that were born with scales which became elongated on the forelimb. Those reptiles, in turn, had baby reptiles which had another mutation that caused the scales to get longer and longer and longer. And those scales were beginning to evolve into early feathers. Over a period of millions of years and tens of thousands of generations, mutations kept occurring that were causing the lengthening of these scales. And eventually it evolved into a wing, according to evolutionists. Well, there's a problem with this scenario, and that is this. If you can imagine a lizard running around whose scales are gradually, over time, a population of lizards whose scales are gradually getting longer and longer and longer over time, pretty soon you've got these scales hanging down several inches off the forelimb of a lizard. The lizard cannot yet fly, but now it has a problem. It can't hardly run either. So natural selection now acts on the lizard and wipes it out. And here's why. The lizard is not a more fit organism. It cannot yet fly, but because it cannot run, it cannot successfully compete with its fellow critters. It cannot successfully compete for resources. Secondly, it cannot successfully evade its predators. So what happens? Natural selection, which allows the survival of the fittest, wipes out the lizard, and the primordial wing that has attempted to evolve is wiped out, and the experiment is a failure. You see, natural selection favors the more fit structures and the more fit organisms. And a transitional stage is not more fit than what it came from. Regarding this problem of what I call the non-viability of transitional forms, biologist Gertrude Himmelfarb, in her book Darwin and the Darwinian Revolution, said this: "The eye, as one of the most complex organs, has been the symbol and archetype of Darwin's dilemma. Since the eye is obviously of no use at all except in its final, complete form, how could natural selection have functioned in those initial stages of its evolution when the variations had no possible survival value? No single variation, indeed no single part, being of any use without every other, and natural selection presuming no knowledge of the ultimate end or purpose of the organ." Stephen Jay Gould, a very famous scientist from Harvard University, wrote in his book, in an article called "The Return of Hopeful Monsters" in Natural History, Volume 86, he said this. He said, "Of what possible use are the imperfect, incipient stages of useful structures?" In other words, he says, what good is half a jaw, or what good is half a wing? He recognized that transitional structures, such as half-developed wings, are not beneficial to the organism. And so natural selection wipes them out. And this is the second point that I want you to see. If you can see that transitional structures like a transitional wing or a transitional lung or a transitional heart are not as functional as what they came from, then you can, with this second prong, easily see how Darwinian evolution does not work. If this was not enough, in complex animals like you and me, the systems themselves, the visual system, the gastrointestinal system, the nervous system, the respiratory system, all of those systems are then indeed integrated to an even higher level. For example, the visual system is connected to the digestive system. How many of you have been watching a football game or something and a Big Mac commercial comes on and you look and you go, oh, and you start salivating, oh, and you're hungry. Your eyes are seeing something that it likes, and so you start to salivate, and you start to get hunger pangs. That's why McDonald's spends hundreds of millions of dollars to produce these commercials because they know when they run the commercial, at halftime, millions of people get up and drive to their car to go get the Big Mac, okay? Because the visual system is connected to the digestive system. The respiratory system and the cardiovascular system are also connected to the visual system. When we see a predator coming, what happens? It stimulates a complex process to get your body ready for what they call the fight or flight response. You start breathing harder, your heart starts pumping harder, adrenaline is released in your body to get your muscles and all of your organs ready to either fight or split, okay, the fight or flight response. And so the visual system is connected integrally to all of the other systems. And each of the systems affects each of the other systems in very, very complex ways. And it staggers the mind to imagine how complex systems with this kind of integration could be built in a piecemeal, meaning a step-by-step fashion over millions of years, when the transitional forms for those systems are not viable and do not increase the survivability of the organism. And this points out the difficulty of the transitional forms. And indeed, the fossil record has failed to document any significant true transitional forms. Charles Darwin, in his book, The Origin of Species, on page 163, said this. He said, "But, as by this theory, innumerable transitional forms must have existed. Why do we not find them embedded in the countless numbers? Why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth?" He goes on. He says, "The number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this, perhaps, is the most obvious and serious objection which can be argued against the theory of evolution." It's on page 323. So Darwin admitted there was no evidence in the fossil record for the transitional forms, and that's because they never existed. Darwin went on to say that the reason that those transitional forms were not found in the fossil record is because of the imperfection of the fossil record. Stephen Jay Gould, Harvard University geologist again, writing in an article called Evolution's Erratic Pace in Natural History, Volume 5, May 1977, said this: "The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. The evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, but not on the evidence of the fossils. We fancy ourselves as the only true students of life's history. Yet, to preserve our favorite account of evolution by natural selection, we view our data as so bad that we never see the very process we profess to study." He says there are no transitional forms. And he says that the evolutionary trees that you see in your textbooks are based on the fossils? No, they're based on inference. Inference is a sophisticated word which means they guessed. They guessed. Now, let me talk to you about a couple of supposed evidences for evolution, and then we'll wrap this up. Over the last several thousand years, we've been able to successfully breed a number of different varieties of cats and dogs and horses and many other plants and animals. This type of breeding, where you breed animals, you select out certain traits that you like, and you breed those animals with animals that have similar traits, evolutionists call microevolution. And they state that microevolution, the idea that mutations can produce these small variations, is proof that evolution does occur. And they say that if you just take that type of microevolution, which is the wide variation that you see within a species, if you take that and give it enough time, it will indeed produce over time new species, which cannot interbreed with the previous species. But it turns out, say for example, if you take the horse, you can create in a matter of one man's lifetime, if you start with two medium brown horses, and you breed them, you can produce in one man's lifetime 18-inch tall horses that weigh 50 pounds, and from those same two, they generally have to be wild brown horses, you can produce giant 6.5 feet tall, 2,500 pound horses from the original medium brown horses. And you can do that by simply selective breeding. They call it microevolution, but really what it is simply selecting the information that was already present in the medium brown horses that you picked. So it's literally variation within the kind. That is why you can get such wide varieties in nature of different types of animals. At the San Diego Zoo, they do a lot of different breeding experiments. As in around the world, they do a lot of breeding experiments. San Diego Zoo has successfully produced a species called a liger. A liger is a cat which was produced by the breeding of a lion and a tiger. In fact, there's also been experiments where they've been able to get the sperm of a plain house cat to breed with lions and produce medium-sized cats. What that means is that there's apparently one cat kind, just as there's one horse kind. Most of you have probably seen pictures of horses that have been bred with zebras. They're not separate species. They're all one kind with tremendous variation within the kind. And that does not represent evolution. It simply represents the origin of these different variations within a kind because they've been isolated in an environment for a long time. This variation within a kind is present within the genetic code of the original, say, medium brown dog, medium brown cat, medium brown horse, etc., whatever you start out with. When I was in college, I was taught that one of the evidences of evolution was something called the peppered moth. Any of you here heard about the peppered moth? Yeah, a few of you. The story goes like this. Prior to the Industrial Revolution in England, there was a species of moth, which was a white moth that had little black speckles on it. And that white moth lived on the white birch trees in England. And because of its color, the birds could not see it. There were occasionally born to these peppered moths black-colored moths. And the black moths could be picked off by the birds because they were so visible. Well, something happened during the Industrial Revolution, and that is the trees turned black. Because of the soot from the smokestacks, the trees around England became black. And so now the white moth was more visible, and the white moth was then being eaten by the birds. And the black moth, which before used to get wiped out, now became the predominant kind of peppered moth in the population. And I was told that this is proof of evolution. And I said, I believe it. Well, the problem is that after the Industrial Revolution, when England got cleaned up, the trees turned white again. And you know what happened? The moths went back to being predominantly white. And I was never told that in my biology class. And what that represents is simply variation within a kind. There was a selection pressure, they call it, to produce black moths because of the color of the trees. But when the trees got cleaned up, it went back to being white moths. And so the variation was present all the time inside the peppered moth population. That process is not really evolution. It's simply variation within a kind, or what some people might call microevolution. When I was in medical school, I was told that we have proof of evolution. In one man's lifetime, bacteria of all kinds have developed resistance to antibiotics. Has anybody here been told that? We have proof of evolution that bacteria has evolved resistance to antibiotics. And I was told that was proof that it could occur fairly rapidly. Well, in 1849, a man, an Englishman by the name of John Franklin, set out on an expedition. Okay, remember this is 1849, 90 years before penicillin was developed. He set out on an expedition to try to find a northern passage from England over Canada to get over to Russia. And his crew and the ships became shipwrecked on an island up near the Arctic Circle, and all of his men eventually perished. They died slowly. Some people think that they died of arsenic poisoning because of improper canning techniques. But nevertheless, they died. Every one of them died, and they perished, and they ceremonially buried each other, and they left burial markers. Well, in 1989, an expedition from a Canadian university decided to go to this island and do autopsies on these men. These men had been frozen. This is above the Arctic Circle, where it's frozen all year long. These men had been frozen in permafrost in marked graves since 1849. They dug these men up, and someone had the foresight to do, when they did the autopsy on these men, they were perfectly formed, perfectly preserved. Someone had the foresight to culture the bacteria in the intestinal tract of these men that died in 1849. They took the bacteria back. They brought them back to the University of Saskatchewan in Canada, and someone had a brilliant idea. Let's see if these bacteria are resistant to antibiotics. And you know what they found out? The bacteria in the gut of these men were not only resistant to antibiotics, they were resistant to antibiotics that were synthetic antibiotics that were produced by chemists in laboratories in the 1980s and in the 1980s. Synthetic antibiotics. What that means is the genetic capability of surviving the assault of antibiotics was present in the genetic code of bacteria before antibiotics were developed. Because penicillin wasn't developed until the 1930s and 40s. Think about that. What that means is it wasn't evolution at all. That the origin of antibiotic resistance was present way before the antibiotics, even synthetic antibiotics, were developed. Could it be that God put the genetic capability to resist antibiotics in those bacteria because he knew when we discovered antibiotics we would wipe the bacteria out in our guts and those bacteria are beneficial? Could be. Pretty interesting. Some people will say that microevolution, which is what they said occurred in the peppered moth, if given enough time, microevolution plus long time periods will give you what is called macroevolution, which is the origin of new species. Well, a number of different scientists have looked at that and come to the conclusion that that is indeed not true. One gentleman by the name of Roger Lewin, writing in Evolution Theory Under Fire in Science, which is a very evolutionary-based journal, volume 210, number 21, page 883 in 1980, said this. He was commenting on a conference in Chicago on the mechanisms of evolution. He said the central question of the Chicago conference was whether the mechanisms underlying microevolution can be extrapolated to explain the phenomena of macroevolution, that is, the production of new species. At the risk of doing violence to the positions of some of the people at the meeting, the answer can be given as a clear no. He says that time does not help you out. Adding long periods of time does not help you out because time causes the accumulation of so many harmful mutations within a population that the population becomes extinct before it becomes improved. What does that leave us? What are the options? If chance, Darwinian evolution, over long periods of time cannot produce new complex structures, if it cannot produce viable transitional forms and ultimately more complex forms, then what does it leave us? Well, according to Stephen Jay Gould, the gentleman that said there is no evidence in the fossil record for transitional forms, he said, well, Darwin was wrong. See, Darwin said that evolution occurred over a long period of time through very small steps and very small stages. And Stephen Jay Gould said, no, that's not how it happened. He says, see, we know evolution's a fact. It's a fact. But if it was occurring slowly, we should expect to find transitional forms. But we don't. And so Stephen Jay Gould said, well, then evolution must occur quickly. So he devised the concept of punctuated equilibrium. He says, fancy term, isn't it? Punctuated equilibrium. He says that populations are in equilibrium, meaning they don't change for long periods of time. And then some sort of environmental stress occurs which punctuates a population and causes the population to evolve very quickly in a matter of a few million years instead of hundreds of millions of years from one species, say from a reptile, to a bird. Punctuated equilibrium. And that's what he proposed. Well, the problem with that is the amount of mutations that would be harmful and lethal would be accumulating so rapidly that geneticists have examined this theory and have come to the conclusion that it's wrong. Now, the primary evidence for punctuated equilibrium is, get this, no transitional forms. So, a lack of fossils is proof that evolution must have occurred quickly. Isn't that an interesting proof? Punctuated equilibrium. I would say it's punctuated absurdity, personally, but... So what's the third option? The third option is that all of the systems, visual system, auditory system, etc., had to have been created with all of the parts there simultaneously. And to do that, you either have to believe that a reptile could hatch a baby bird in one generation. It's called a hopeful monster. Or you have to believe that it was done by intelligent design and purpose and contrivance. And obviously, that is a very viable option. Darwinian evolution does not allow for the production of complex structures which have multiple subcomponents. Darwinian evolution and natural selection will select out the transitional forms because they're not viable. And your only option is either hopeful monsters. Well, you could maybe throw in extraterrestrials. Some people say extraterrestrials periodically flew down and injected extra DNA into organisms, and that caused them to evolve. Well, if you're going to believe in extraterrestrials, you might as well believe in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and all that other stuff. So E.T., come back to E.T. again, right? Extraterrestrials or God or hopeful monsters, like Stephen Jay Gould put it. In the Bible, in Genesis 2, verse 7, it says that God made man from the dust of the earth. 100 trillion cells from head to toe, with enough information in each DNA molecule of all your cells to fill the Grand Canyon with books. If you were to print the information stored in your DNA molecules, you could fill the Grand Canyon 50 times, according to some scientists. That's how much information is in your DNA molecules of every cell in your body. Chuck mentioned that we're made of the same basic 17 elements that are found outside in a planter. So we're all very complex dirt clods. One cell in your body is more complex than a Cray supercomputer or a space shuttle. The option is it happened in a piecemeal, random chance, step-by-step process, or it happened all at once. It's your pick. It's your choice. I prefer to believe, now that I've looked at this in my own life, that indeed it did happen. It happened suddenly and abruptly, but not through some hopeful monster. The Bible says in Psalm 139 that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And that Creator, who existed beyond time and space, has entered time and space and revealed to us His love, His nature, His power in the person of Jesus Christ. That Creator, that transcendent one, made it very simple for us to have communion with Him. Basically, He said that He was the way, the truth, and the life. And no one could come to the Father except through Him. Now, I struggled for many, many years in college and in medical school about the issue of God and the issue of creation and all of that. I dissected an entire human being from head to toe in medical school. I've held every organ of the human body in my hand and looked at it under a microscope. And I believed that it was the product of a lightning bolt striking a puddle 3 billion years ago, and I went from the goo through the zoo to you. But once I looked at these logical thought processes and the fact that we are fearfully integrated, complex systems, I knew it couldn't happen by chance. It had to be by design. And where there's design, there is a designer. And the question is, what are you going to do about it? You have a choice. You can worship the God called chance, that chance produced you. Or you can worship the Creator who exists beyond time and space, who expressed His love by dying on a Roman cross 2,000 years ago, and simply asks that you believe. Simply believe. It's a free gift. Let's pray.